In 1851, the British government did something, well, completely unprecedented.
And honestly, a little dangerous if you think about the social climate back then.
Oh, absolutely dangerous.
Mm.
They conducted this massive nationwide religious census. So for the very first time in history, they essentially went out and counted how many people were actually sitting in the pews on a given Sunday.
Right, they wanted the raw numbers. No more guessing.
Exactly. And the results completely shocked the Victorian establishment to its core. I mean, the vast majority of the British public were nowhere near a church.
Which is wild because the institutional power of religion in the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution was, already showing these massive, undeniable cracks.
Yeah, but here's where it gets crazy. If you cross the Atlantic Ocean at that exact same time, you see the exact opposite happening.
Right, the American frontiers were just absolutely exploding.
Yeah, you have these massive tent revivals, booming church construction, just this incredible religious fervor everywhere.
It's really one of the most fascinating historical divergences. You have these two cultures, right? Sharing a language, sharing deep historical roots, but they end up taking wildly different trajectories when it comes to the role of faith in public life.
Which, poses a pretty massive question for anyone looking at society today. Why did those two essentially identical cultures split like that?
It's the big question.
Right. Like, why are these historic, gorgeous cathedrals in Europe practically empty museums today, while, you can drive through basically any American suburb and see warehouse-style megachurches packing in 10,000 people a weekend?
And looking even broader than just church attendance, right? Why are our society's biggest moral debates, like the truly heavy existential stuff, why are they no longer settled by quoting scripture?
Oh, yeah. We bring in, like, scientists,
Right.
psychologists, lawyers.
Exactly. That shift, that fundamental rewiring of how a whole society makes its decisions, that is what sociologists are talking about when they use the word secularization.
And that is exactly what we are plunging into today. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are taking on a truly monumental foundational text in sociology.
Brian R. Wilson's 1966 classic, Religion in Secular Society.
Yes, specifically, we are looking at the 2016 edition because it includes some incredibly sharp, updated commentary by the sociologist Steve Bruce.
It is a phenomenal piece of scholarship,
Wow.
really groundbreaking, but right out of the gate, we probably need to calibrate our terminology a bit.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Because I know you and I, and pretty much everyone listening, have heard the term secularization thrown around a lot in political debates.
Usually it's framed as an ideological weapon, right?
Right. You have some pundit on TV warning that, the secularists are coming to destroy religion.
Or on the flip side, it's used triumphantly by atheists as just a synonym for enlightenment or progress.
But we need to look at this purely through a sociological lens. We aren't taking political sides here, and neither is Wilson. We're just looking at the objective data of human organization.
Exactly. For Wilson, secularization does not mean that you, the individual, no longer have spiritual curiosity. It doesn't mean people stop praying in private or, stop wondering about the afterlife.
It's not about what's in your head or your heart.
Right. He defines secularization strictly as the process by which religious thinking, practices, and institutions lose their primary social significance.
It's about social power. It's about whether the institutions of religion still dictate how the economy runs, how the government operates, how education is structured.
And how the culture at large determines what is true and what is false.
Precisely. I mean, in the medieval period, religious motives and religious professionals were the ultimate arbiters of society. Today, they are socially marginal.
They exist, sure, but they are not the driving force anymore.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because I want to stop on that point for a second and look
What?
at the man who actually developed this framework. Brian R. Wilson is not the guy you'd expect to write this.
Not at all.
Right. When you think of a mid-20th century Oxford sociologist diagnosing the decline of religion, you probably picture, I don't know, a very liberal, progressive academic cheering on the death of the old order.
But Wilson's background flips that completely on its head. He is a walking contradiction in the best possible way.
Yeah. Tell us about where he started.
Well, he was born in 1926 in Leeds. He's a working-class kid. The biographical notes in the text actually highlight that his family didn't even have running hot water.
Wow.
Yeah, and the communal toilet was 30 yards up a cobbled street. He ended up leaving school at 13.
13. And he starts working as an accountant's office boy, right? Then he gets drafted into the Army.
Yep. And then, purely through sheer grit, he leverages a military gratuity and some government grants, and he just studies his way into the London School of Economics.
Which is already a huge leap.
Hmm.
But he doesn't stop there. He ultimately ends up as a fellow at All Souls College, Oxford.
Which is the absolute pinnacle of the British academic elite. I mean, All Souls doesn't even take undergraduates. It is purely a research institution.
And Wilson completely assimilated into this high tradition environment, didn't he?
Oh, completely. He famously managed the college's renowned wine cellars. He wore these very formal lounge suits as his everyday attire. He was deeply, fundamentally conservative in his temperament.
Which honestly changes the whole paradigm of how we should read his work. He is not celebrating secularization. He isn't writing a victory lap for atheism.
No, he was a sociological functionalist. He believed that for a society to survive, it needed shared values, a shared moral vocabulary, and social cohesion.
And historically, religion provided that glue.
That is the key to understanding his tone. He is observing the decline of religion and recognizing that society is losing its traditional stabilizing force. And he is profoundly anxious about what will replace it.
I read his approach like a highly meticulous old school structural engineer. You know, he gets called in to inspect this beautiful historic building.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, he's walking the perimeter, he's tapping the masonry, checking the load-bearing walls. And he finally turns to the owners and says, look, I love this architecture, but the foundation is fatally compromised. The soil has fundamentally shifted beneath us.
That captures his methodology perfectly. He's delivering an objective clinical diagnosis of collapse, even if he hates to see the building go down.
Right, and to understand what he means by the soil shifting beneath us, we really have to look at his core thesis regarding the modern worldview.
Yes. Wilson argues that prior to the Industrial Revolution, society operated on religious legitimation. But today, modern society operates on what he calls a pragmatic Weltanschauung.
A pragmatic worldview. Let's dig into the mechanism of that, because it's not just that people woke up one day, had a cup of coffee, and decided to stop believing.
No, it's much deeper than that. The physical reality of how human beings survived actually changed, which kind of rewired our brains.
This is where sociology intersects with economics and technology, right?
Exactly. Think about an agrarian society. If you are a 17th century farmer, your survival depends entirely on the weather, disease, just natural forces completely outside your control.
Right. You can't control a drought.
Exactly. And in that environment of profound uncertainty, you seek theological answers. You pray for rain. You interpret a bad harvest as divine judgment.
The world is enchanted, basically, and causes are supernatural.
But then you transition to an industrial and later a technological society. If I'm a 20th century factory manager and my production line stops, I don't call a priest to perform an exorcism on the machinery.
No, you call a mechanic to fix a broken gear.
Exactly. Industrialization introduced a world of rational organization, bureaucratic efficiency, and empirical cause and effect.
So modern people act in response to instrumental tests.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does this tool work? Is this process efficient? What are the empirical metrics? This pragmatic worldview fundamentally displaces the need for theological explanations in our daily lives.
The environment is no longer enchanted. It is managed.
And that is a huge shift. So it's not that a scientist stood on a stage somewhere and logically proved God doesn't exist to the masses.
It's that the daily mechanics of surviving and thriving in a modern city require a completely different set of mental tools. You just stop asking, is this righteous? And you start asking, does this work?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the place where this shift was most undeniable in 1966 was Wilson's home turf, England.
The data there really provides the baseline for his entire theory of decline, doesn't it?
It does. Let's look at that English evidence because the numbers are just staggering.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the mid-19th century, even with that shocking 1851 census I mentioned earlier, you still had roughly 40% of the English population actively engaged in church-going.
Right. The culture was still thoroughly saturated with religious language.
But by the mid-20th century, the bottom completely falls out.
It's a comprehensive institutional collapse. Average Sunday attendance plummets to somewhere around 10 to 15%. And even that is heavily buoyed by the Roman Catholic population, which maintained higher attendance temporarily due to Irish immigration and larger family sizes. But across the board, the metrics of participation crater.
The one metric that really stood out to me in the sources was the collapse of Sunday school attendance.
Oh, that's a huge one.
Because Sunday school used to be a massive cultural institution in Britain. It was where working-class children learned to read, learned morality, learned citizenship, and it just vanishes.
Easter communion participation, too. That was the absolute high watermark of the Christian liturgical year, and it shrinks to a fraction of its former self.
Which leaves the historic Church of England in a very strange position, sociologically speaking.
Wilson uses this brilliant, rather clinical term to describe what the national church became. He calls it a residual claimant.
A residual claimant. Right, so it means that the church claims the vast majority of the population, and the population claims the church, but only on paper.
Exactly. It's a default identity marker. If you ask an Englishman in 1960 what his religion is, he says C of E.
Not because he was in the pews on Sunday, but just because he isn't Catholic and he isn't Jewish.
Right. It's synonymous with being English. It is a nominal affiliation stripped of any behavioral demands. The church has a massive theoretical membership, but virtually zero mobilization power.
Now, the critical question is why this happened. And Wilson's answer goes far beyond just a change in intellectual beliefs, right?
Yes. He introduces the concept of the usurpation of functions.
This is one of the most powerful mechanisms in the whole text. Religion didn't just lose arguments. Religion lost its actual jobs.
Think about the role of the local parish in a pre-modern European village. It was a comprehensive social service agency.
Oh, totally. If you needed education, the church ran the school. If you were starving, the church distributed alms. If you were an orphan, the church provided the orphanage.
The church was the only institution with the infrastructure and the wealth to handle social welfare. You had to engage with the church just to survive.
But then the modern nation-state emerges. And the state looks at these functions and essentially says, hey, we can do this better, more universally, and more rationally.
The creation of the modern welfare state is a massive engine of secularization. The government creates compulsory secular public schools. It institutes national health services.
Social security safety nets, professionalized social work departments. The state systematically usurps the functions that previously made the church indispensable to the average citizen.
And once the government is providing your safety net, your reliance on the local vicar drops to zero. The church becomes socially marginal because you simply don't need it anymore.
And the sources point out it wasn't just the government taking over the heavy stuff. The entertainment industry completely usurped the church's role in shaping culture and values.
Oh, absolutely. The rise of mass media, first radio, then cinema, then television, it broke the clergy's monopoly on communication.
Historically, the Sunday sermon was the primary piece of mass communication a person received all week, right?
Exactly. The clergyman was the loudest voice in the room. He defined what was moral, what was normal, what was expected.
But once you have a cinema in every town and a radio in every living room, the clergyman is suddenly competing against Hollywood.
And the entertainment industry isn't just competing for people's time and money. It is offering entirely alternative scripts for how to live.
Right. It shows you glamorous lifestyles, different moral frameworks, different ways to find happiness that have absolutely nothing to do with salvation.
And this combination, of the state usurping social welfare, science usurping the explanation of the physical world, and media usurping the moral imagination, it leads directly to a profound sociological crisis for the clergy.
Wilson talks about the severe demotion of the clerical profession.
Yes. In previous centuries, if you were a clergyman, you were part of the unquestioned intellectual elite. You were likely the most educated person in your town.
You were the historian, the philosopher, the counselor, the scholar.
But as society modernizes, it fragments into highly specialized professions based on rational, empirical knowledge.
So if a family is experiencing psychological distress, they no longer go to the priest for spiritual direction. They go to a licensed, credentialed psychologist.
And if a community faces a social crisis, they don't consult the bishop. They bring in urban planners and sociologists.
And Wilson describes the clergy in the modern era as, get this, amiable amateurs, which is such a devastating phrase.
It really is. They are still institutionally entrenched. They get to wear the robes, they officiate state ceremonies, they have these massive cathedrals, but intellectually, society has moved past them.
They don't possess the specialized, pragmatic knowledge that modern bureaucracies actually value. They are essentially generalists in a world that only respects specialists.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on this narrative of total decline for a second, because I think a lot of people listening will look at modern England or Europe in general and say, wait a minute, when there's a national tragedy, The cathedrals are absolutely packed.
That's true, they are.
And when people get married, they still want the gorgeous church wedding with the organ and the stained glass. When someone dies, they want a traditional funeral.
Doesn't that lingering attachment prove that religion still fundamentally matters to the human psyche?
It's a very common pushback, and Wilson addresses it head-on. He doesn't deny that people still utilize the church for those events, but he distinguishes between religion as an aesthetic backdrop and religion as an organizing social authority.
Okay, so yes, people want the solemnity and the historical weight of a cathedral for a rite of passage.
Right.
It's the vintage typewriter analogy. I love this.
Oh, go ahead. Explain that one.
So a lot of modern writers keep a beautifully restored 1920s Underwood typewriter on their desk. It looks incredible. It has historical weight. It makes them feel connected to a great tradition.
No.
But when they actually need to write a 90,000-word novel on a deadline, they use a MacBook. The typewriter is an aesthetic choice. The laptop is the functional reality. That is a perfect translation of Wilson's point. The church is the vintage typewriter. People use it for the aesthetics of a wedding or a funeral, but, and this is the crucial sociological test, does that institution exert any daily moral control over how those people live?
Right. Does it dictate their sexual ethics, their financial decisions, or how they vote?
No. They leave the wedding, take off the tuxedo, and go right back to living according to generalized, secular, pragmatic norms.
Exactly. Using the church for a rite of passage is very different from submitting to its authority. The texture of social relationships in Europe is entirely secularized, even if the buildings are still standing.
So Wilson builds this incredibly tight, convincing case using the English stater. Modernization brings science, bureaucracy, and the welfare state.
Those things usurp the church's functions.
The church loses its social power. Secularization is the inevitable byproduct of becoming a modern society. It seems like a bulletproof theory.
But there's a massive geographical elephant in the room that we have to address.
The American paradox.
Right. Because if secularization is the universal, unavoidable destiny of any industrialized, scientifically advanced society, then the United States in the mid-20th century should look exactly like England.
In fact, since America is arguably more technologically advanced and consumer-driven in 1966, it should be more secular.
But the statistical reality was the exact opposite. Throughout the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, American church membership, attendance, and financial giving were booming.
They were building massive suburban congregations everywhere. Religion was a highly visible, highly energetic part of the American landscape.
So how does Wilson's theory survive this?
Mhm.
Did secularization just politely skip over North America?
Not at all. Wilson argues that secularization absolutely conquered America, but it did so through a completely different mechanism.
Okay, how so?
In Europe, the people secularized by abandoning the churches. In America, the people stayed in the churches, but the churches themselves secularized from within.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the sociology gets so counterintuitive and brilliant. To understand how a church secularizes from within, we have to go back to the immigrant experience.
Because America is a nation of immigrants arriving in a totally chaotic, pluralistic environment.
Right. So you have to imagine being like a wave of immigrants from Italy or Germany or Norway in the late 19th century.
You arrive in a rapidly expanding, highly diverse, often hostile new world.
And you don't have the centuries-old social safety nets of your European village. You are isolated. So for these immigrant communities, the local ethnic church became their absolute lifeline.
Think about a Swedish immigrant stepping off the boat in Minnesota. The Swedish Lutheran Church isn't just a place to pray, it is an assimilation hub.
It's the one place where people speak your language, understand your cultural norms, and can help you navigate the American system.
The church served profoundly secular social functions. It was a mutual aid society. It helped you find a job. It cared for you if you got sick. It served as a marriage market to ensure your children married within the ethnic group.
People flocked to these churches because they desperately needed community and identity in a pluralistic society, not necessarily because they were consumed by strict theological piety.
But the immigrant waves eventually settle down. You get to the second, third, and fourth generations. They are fully Americanized. They speak English. They are integrated into the broader economy. What happens to the religion then?
This is where American religion uniquely adapts to the American dream of capitalism and social mobility. Wilson traces this fascinating phenomenon of how religious intensity actually fuels upward mobility, which in turn destroys the original religious intensity.
It's an incredible cycle. Let's look at the specific case study of early sectarian groups in America, like the Methodists or the Church of the Nazarene in their early days.
These groups almost always start among the poor, the working class, the socially marginalized, right?
Yes. And their theology is initially very fierce and world-rejecting. They preach that the mainstream society is corrupt, wealthy people are sinful, and true believers must separate themselves.
The sources mention the incredible strictness of these early groups. It wasn't just abstract theology, it was intense behavioral control.
They had strict rules prohibiting any frivolous spending. No going to the theater, no gambling, no drinking alcohol.
They even had rules about the number of petticoats women were allowed to wear, or the exact height a dress had to be from the ground to prevent vanity.
It was a highly disciplined, ascetic lifestyle. But think about the unintended economic consequences of that theology. If you have a community of working-class people who believe that hard work is a divine calling, who never spend money on alcohol, who never gamble, who eschew expensive clothing and entertainment, what happens to their bank accounts?
They accumulate capital.
Yay.
Even on meager wages, their frugality means they start saving money.
Precisely. The strict religious discipline instills an incredible work ethic and enforces financial savings. Within a generation, these poor, marginalized believers achieve significant social mobility.
They buy property, they start small businesses, they enter the middle class.
And here is the sociological punchline. Once you have achieved middle-class respectability, you don't really want to be part of a weird fringe sect that dictates how many petticoats your wife can wear and tells you that wealth is a sin.
Exactly. As the members gained wealth and social status, the strict, embarrassing rules were quietly dropped. The churches physically transformed.
They moved out of modest wooden halls and built prestigious neo-Gothic stone structures with stained glass. They founded respectable liberal arts colleges. They completely adopted the values of the wider secular middle-class society.
It perfectly mirrors the life cycle of a punk rock band. Think about it.
Okay, lay it out for me.
So a punk band starts out playing in sweaty, underground basements. The music is aggressive, the lyrics are all about tearing down the capitalist system, and the fans are these hardcore, anti-establishment kids who demand absolute authenticity.
Right, they hate anything mainstream.
But then, the band gets a little older, they learn how to play their instruments better. A major record label offers them a contract. Suddenly, they are playing massive arenas, their songs are polished for radio airplay, and tickets cost $150.
They undergo gentrification.
Exactly. They keep the aggressive band name. They still sell black t-shirts with the spiky, rebellious logo. The branding remains the same, but the actual product, the music, has been completely altered to please a mass mainstream audience. They sold out their original edge to survive and thrive in the market.
That is Wilson's exact diagnosis of American denominations. They sold out their strict, demanding, world-rejecting theology to accommodate a mass, affluent audience.
American religion became a vehicle for asserting social status, rather than a desperate plea for salvation.
The doctrine was diluted, completely diluted.
Right. The theology shifted away from concepts of hellfire, original sin, and strict moral boundaries. Those concepts make affluent people uncomfortable.
Instead, the message moved toward optimism, personal success, civic responsibility, and psychological comfort. The sermon became less about saving your immortal soul from the wrath of God and more about how God wants you to have a happy marriage, a positive mindset, and a successful career.
So if you're a sociologist looking at the data in 1960, yes, the American churches are full, but the content of the religion being preached inside those full buildings has been entirely hollowed out and replaced by generic, secular American values.
The church is no longer critiquing the culture. It is just a mirror reflecting the culture back at itself.
And if an institution is merely echoing what the broader culture already believes, it has lost its primary social influence. It isn't leading, it is following. It is secularized from within.
Which brings us to a massive structural problem. As these various American denominations, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the mainstream Baptists, as they all drop their unique, strict doctrines and gentrify to appeal to the same affluent middle class, they start to look exactly like one another.
And the professionals running these organizations, the clergy and the bishops, start to realize they have a problem on their hands.
They realize that fiercely competing against each other over minor historical theological differences no longer makes any rational sense. Their members are interchangeable, their core values are identical, and yet they are maintaining separate, massive administrative overheads in a society where their overall cultural influence is actually shrinking.
Which brings us to the phenomenon of ecumenism. Now, Wilson uses a very specific structural framework to analyze this.
Right, for anyone who might only know the term from a church bulletin, ecumenism is the movement aimed at promoting unity and cooperation among different Christian denominations. The ultimate goal is often structural mergers, bringing divided churches back together into a single body.
But isn't ecumenism usually framed as this beautiful spiritual awakening where everyone decided to finally get along?
That is the popular framing, yes. A moment where Christians finally realized that love and unity are more important than fighting over obscure doctrinal squabbles from the 16th century.
But what's fascinating here is Wilson looks at this and basically says, don't kid yourselves. I love how aggressively he dismantles that romantic notion.
He argues that ecumenism is absolutely not a response to spiritual strength or a sudden burst of theological enlightenment. It is a response to profound institutional weakness.
It is a defensive maneuver. Churches seek to merge when they feel their social influence shrinking and when they feel existentially threatened by a dominant secularized society.
It makes me think of corporate consolidation.
Oh, totally. If you look at the business world, when an industry is booming and expanding, companies fight each other fiercely for every inch of market share.
But when an industry is dying, let's say print media or regional department stores, and suddenly the market is shrinking and they are all losing relevance, they don't keep fighting.
They merge. You get these massive corporate conglomerates. They consolidate their market share, they fire redundant middle managers, they close overlapping branches, and they present a united, larger front to treat and survive the changing economy.
That corporate analogy is exactly how Wilson wants you to view the ecumenical movement. It is a sociological reflex to decline. And he provides a massive piece of evidence to support this cynical but highly accurate view.
What's the evidence?
The drive for unity is almost exclusively championed by the clergy and the denominational bureaucrats, not by the everyday people in the pews.
That is so counterintuitive. You'd think a grassroots movement for love and unity would come from the grassroots.
Yeah.
But you're saying the laity don't actually care about merging with the church down the street.
By and large, no. The laity, the regular members, often have deep, stubborn, local attachments to their specific traditions. They like their specific hymn book. They like the way their specific building looks. They are comfortable with their local particularities.
It is the religious professionals who are desperately pushing for ecumenism.
Because of clerical self-preservation. As we discussed earlier, the clergy have suffered a massive loss of social prestige in the secular world. They feel culturally marginalized.
So how do you regain a sense of importance and power? You associate with other professionals. You hold grand international conferences on unity.
You seek psychological and institutional validation by merging into larger, more statistically impressive organizations. It is fundamentally a bureaucratic movement designed to salvage the status of the clerical profession.
But the cost of this compromise is staggering. If you were going to execute a massive corporate merger between, say, a Methodist body and an Anglican body, you have to deal with the fact that these groups historically had profound, irreconcilable theological differences.
We are talking about the nature of the sacraments, the apostolic succession of the priesthood, whether baptism actually regenerates the soul. People were literally burned at the stake over these distinctions centuries ago.
Right. To unite these historically opposed bodies, you have to essentially sweep all of that deep theology under the rug. You have to negotiate a compromise.
And just like a corporate merger that results in a heavily focused, grouped, incredibly bland product that nobody actually loves, the theological product of ecumenism becomes watered down.
You end up with highly ambiguous, lowest common denominator theology. It has to be vague enough so that it doesn't offend anyone from the merging traditions.
And Wilson points out the ultimate irony here. When a religion waters down its doctrine so much that it demands very little of its members and stands for nothing specific, it actually accelerates the secularization process it was trying to fight.
It becomes intellectually vacant.
Exactly. So by trying to save the institution through mergers, they hollow out the very spiritual core that made them unique in the first place.
But obviously, human nature dictates that not everyone is going to be okay with this. Whenever a mainstream institution compromises its core values to survive, it creates a vacuum. A vacuum for purists who want absolute, uncompromised truth.
And that leads directly to the explosion of sects. When the mainstream denominations compromise with the secular world and merge into bland conglomerates, the highly committed purists break away.
Let's lay out the sociological definitions here, because Wilson is incredibly precise with his terminology. We have three distinct categories: church, denomination, and sect.
Right, a church, with a capital C, is an institution that claims a universal monopoly on truth and territory. Think of the medieval Catholic Church.
It claims that every single person born in its geographic territory belongs to it by right of birth. It encompasses the entire society.
A denomination, on the other hand, is what you get in a modern pluralistic society. It accepts that it is just one of many valid religious options. It plays nicely with others, it accepts the secular state, and it doesn't claim an absolute monopoly.
Which leaves the sect.
A sect is an exclusive, highly demanding protest group. It looks at the compromises of the denominations and the secular society and completely rejects them.
A sect claims to possess the exclusive, unadulterated truth. It demands total voluntary commitment from its members, and it maintains incredibly strict boundaries between the pure believers inside the group and the corrupt world outside.
And Wilson doesn't just treat all sects as a monolith. He provides a brilliant categorization of 4 distinct ways these groups respond to the secular world. Let's walk through these, starting with the conversionist sects.
Okay, conversionist sects are probably the most common, right? They believe the wider world is deeply corrupt, but their solution is to change it by converting individuals one by one.
They emphasize intense, emotional, personal salvation experiences. Pentecostal and evangelical revivalist movements are classic examples. The focus is on saving souls from a dying world.
Then you have the revolutionist sects.
These groups take a much darker view of the world. They believe human society is so utterly corrupt that it cannot be saved by human effort or mass conversions. They are waiting for divine intervention.
They believe God is going to directly overturn the world order, destroy the wicked, and establish a new kingdom.
Groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses fit into this category, with their intense focus on eschatology and the impending end of the current system.
Third are the introversionist sects.
Introversionists neither try to convert the world nor wait for its fiery destruction. They simply withdraw from it. They believe the only way to maintain purity is to physically and culturally separate themselves from modern society.
They turn inward to cultivate a pure community of the elect. The early Quakers are a historical example, but the most visible modern example would be the Amish, who deliberately reject modern technology and secular education to maintain their boundaries.
And finally, the 4th category, which I think is the most fascinating reflection of modern culture: the manipulationist sects.
Oh, manipulationist sects are a highly unique adaptation to a rationalized scientific society. They don't reject the modern world's desire for empirical results. They co-opt it.
They claim to offer pseudo-rational, almost scientific formulas for achieving success, health, and wealth in this life. Christian Science is the primary example Wilson analyzes.
It is brilliant because it perfectly mirrors modern corporate bureaucracy. Manipulationist sects feel exactly like modern self-help gurus or life-hacking seminars or multi-level marketing structures.
They completely adopt the language and structure of the secular world. The sources point out they use terms like reading rooms, practitioners, institutes, and boards of directors.
But they are promising supernatural or metaphysical results.
It is religion dressed up in a corporate scientific suit. It appeals to the pragmatic worldview. If modern people want empirical results, a manipulationist sect promises a system that guarantees health and wealth if you just apply the correct mental or spiritual formulas.
So sects form as a fierce protest against secularization. But the big question in sociology is, do they actually last? Or does the modern world eventually grind them down too?
Which brings up a foundational concept in the sociology of religion, H. Richard Niebuhr's one-generation theory.
Niebuhr's posited a very famous, very deterministic theory that sects inevitably become mainstream denominations within a single generation. His logic is rooted in demographics.
A sect is initially formed by passionate, radical adults who voluntarily choose to rebel against society. They are fired up, but then those adults have children.
And you cannot genetically inherit a spontaneous spiritual rebellion.
Precisely. The second generation is born into the sect. For the children, the strict rules and the isolation are not a radical, exciting choice. They are just the boring tradition they were raised in.
To keep their own children from leaving, the sect inevitably has to start compromising. They have to build Sunday schools to educate them. They have to establish routines.
They relax the strictness to make the religion more palatable to the youth, and before you know it, the fiery, uncompromising sect has cooled down into a respectable, middle-class denomination.
The punk rock band gets old and signs the major label deal.
Exactly. But Wilson adds a really crucial caveat to Niebuhr's theory. He doesn't think it's a universal law.
He pushes back significantly, right?
Yeah.
Wilson argues that Niebuhr's evolutionary path mostly applies to conversionist sects because they are actively engaging with the outside world to win converts, which makes them vulnerable to outside influences.
But Wilson points out that some sects, particularly the introversionist and revolutionist ones, manage to persist for generations without compromising.
How do they manage to defy gravity like that?
By ruthlessly maintaining their boundaries and controlling socialization. Groups like the Amish or the Jehovah's Witnesses manage to survive across generations because they exert incredible control over their members' exposure to the secular world.
They reject higher secular education. They heavily restrict marriage to outsiders.
And crucially, they are not afraid to use excommunication or shunning to expel anyone who strays. By creating a hermetically sealed social environment, they can maintain their sectarian purity indefinitely, defying Niebuhr's one-generation rule.
Okay, we need to take a breath and look at the massive scope of the architecture Wilson has built here. He published this in 1966. He argues that Europe is secularizing via institutional collapse and empty pews. America is secularizing internally by hollowing out its doctrine to chase middle-class status.
The clergy are panicking and merging denominations, watering everything down further, and the purists are retreating into isolated, heavily policed sects.
It is a sweeping, grand theory of the modern world. But the critical question for you and me, sitting here decades later, is, did Wilson actually get it right?
And that is exactly what the 2016 edition addresses. Steve Bruce, a prominent sociologist of religion in his own right, provides extensive appendices evaluating Wilson's legacy.
Right. He addresses the major critics who attacked the theory over the last 50 years and looks at the contemporary data to see if the prophecy held up.
Let's start with the pushback, because any theory this massive is going to draw fire. One of the most significant critics mentioned in the sources is David Martin, a contemporary of Wilson's.
What was the core of Martin's attack on secularization theory?
David Martin attacked the historical premise. He argued that to claim religion is declining, you have to prove there was a past golden age of faith from which it fell. Martin argued that Wilson oversimplified history to make his theory work.
He pointed out that the Middle Ages weren't actually a period of universal, pure, pious devotion, right?
Right. Martin brings out historical records showing that the average medieval peasant was often ignorant of basic theology. They treated the saints like local magical spirits.
They chattered and gossiped during the Latin Mass because they didn't understand what the priest was saying. It wasn't exactly a society of pure theological scholars.
Furthermore, Martin warned that the very term secularization was frequently being hijacked by ideologues. He argued that militant atheists were using the sociological theory as a weapon to make the decline of religion seem like an inevitable, progressive evolution of humanity, painting religion as a primitive superstition that modern man must discard.
Which is exactly why we had to set those ground rules at the beginning of the show. So how does Steve Bruce defend Wilson against Martin's historical critique?
Bruce offers a very strong defense by refocusing on the definition of secularization. He acknowledges Martin's historical point. Yes, the past was complex, and medieval peasants weren't all devout theologians. But Bruce argues that individual piety is not the metric that matters. What matters is institutional power.
Even if the peasant was bored during Mass, the church still owned the land, legitimated the king, ran the courts, and controlled the calendar.
Exactly. The institutional power of the church in the past was absolute, regardless of what the peasant was whispering in the back row. The church baptized everyone, married everyone, and buried everyone. Today, it does not.
Therefore, Bruce argues, the macro trajectory of institutional decline is an undeniable, objective reality, completely surviving Martin's critique of the Golden Age.
But then we get to the biggest, most aggressive counter-theory in the sociology of religion over the last 40 years. This is the one that really challenged Wilson's view, particularly regarding America.
We have to talk about Rodney Stark and the rational choice or supply-side theory of religion. And I have to say, this theory is so fundamentally American in its DNA.
It is the application of pure Chicago school free market economic models directly to religious behavior.
I love how audacious it is. Stark essentially looks at religion and says, let's treat this like capitalism. Stark argues that human demand for religion, the desire for meaning, community, and answers about the afterlife is a constant. It never changes.
Therefore, the difference in religious vitality between Europe and America has absolutely nothing to do with modern science or the pragmatic worldview altering demand. The difference is entirely about the supply.
It's all about the structure of the religious market.
Yes, Stark looks at Europe and says, why are the churches empty? Because for centuries, Europe had state-run religious monopolies.
You had the official Church of England, the official Lutheran Church in Sweden.
And just like any state-run monopoly, whether it's religion or the DMV, the product gets lazy. The clergy are guaranteed their salaries by the government. They have no competition, so they stop trying. The product becomes boring and people stop buying.
But then Stark looks at the United States. Thanks to the First Amendment, the U.S. has no state church. It is a completely deregulated free market of religion.
Exactly. You have hundreds of denominations fiercely competing for customers. And because there's intense competition, the churches have to hustle.
They innovate. They offer better music, more engaging preaching, massive youth groups, coffee shops in the lobby. The supply is diverse, aggressive, and highly tailored to consumer preferences.
Therefore, demand stays incredibly high. Stark's argument was that secularization is a myth caused by lazy monopolies. Free market competition creates permanent religious vitality.
It is an incredibly elegant theory, and throughout the 80s and 90s, it seemed absolutely bulletproof. It perfectly explained why American evangelical megachurches were exploding while European state churches were dying.
But this raises an incredibly important question, which Steve Bruce points out with the updated data. If competition creates religious vitality, and America is the ultimate competitive religious free market, why is the profoundly diverse, highly competitive United States also rapidly secularizing today?
The data has shifted drastically since Stark popularized his theory. Bruce brings the receipts. He provides contemporary data showing that the concept of American exceptionalism regarding religion is ending. Generational disaffiliation in the U.S. is now beginning to mirror the European trajectory.
We're seeing the massive rise of the knowns. People who check none of the above on religious surveys, it has skyrocketed over the last 20 years.
The mainline Protestant denominations have experienced a catastrophic collapse in membership. And even the aggressive, innovative evangelical megachurches, the champions of the supply-side model, are now seeing significant generational attrition.
Bruce argues that the free market didn't prevent secularization in America. It merely delayed it. Supply-side theory fails to explain the macro trend because it ignores the deeper corrosive effects of the pragmatic worldview that Wilson identified back in 1966.
So Wilson's diagnosis of America, that it was hollowing itself out to survive and that it would eventually succumb to the same secularizing forces as Europe, was basically prophetic.
It was.
But wait, we have to address one more massive phenomenon in American culture. What about the Christian right? Since the late 1970s, conservative Christianity has been a massive, highly visible political force in America.
It is an absolutely crucial point to address because it is the most common piece of evidence people point to when claiming religion is still powerful.
Right. People look at the political mobilization of the Christian right, forming political action committees, lobbying for legislation, fighting intense culture wars over education and social issues, and they say, look at that. That is raw power. Religion is obviously still an incredibly dominant force in society.
But the sociological analysis in Steve Bruce's update flips that exact assumption on its head.
This is one of the most profound aha moments in the entire text. And again, just to reiterate for you listening, we are looking at this purely as a sociological mechanism, not taking a stance on the politics themselves. How does the sociologist interpret the rise of the Christian right?
Bruce argues that the intense political mobilization of the Christian right is not proof of religious strength. It is actually the definitive proof of advanced secularization.
Proof of secularization, how does that work?
Because you do not form a political action committee and you do not declare a culture war unless you have already lost the culture.
Oh, wow. That changes the whole paradigm.
Think about it historically. In the 19th century or even the early 20th century, conservative Christian values were the assumed, unquestioned baseline of American society.
The churches didn't need to mobilize politically. They didn't need massive lobbying arms because their worldview was the default setting of the courts, the public schools, and the government. They were the king of the castle.
You don't build a defensive fortress and start shooting arrows over the walls unless you realize you don't rule the kingdom anymore.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The very fact that conservative Christians in the late 20th century felt compelled to organize politically, raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and fight defensively shows that they recognized they had lost their position of societal dominance.
They were no longer the assumed moral arbiters. They had been reduced to the status of just one more special interest group competing in a crowded, secular political arena.
That is staggering when you frame it that way. The mobilization is a symptom of displacement.
Furthermore, Bruce's data notes that despite their immense political mobilization and financial power over the last 40 years, they are largely losing the broader cultural battles on macro issues like family structure, sexual ethics, and social norms.
And ironically, the text points out that their highly controversial, aggressive political stances have actively alienated younger generations, which has only served to accelerate the overall decline in church attendance among millennials and Gen Z.
So, if we pull all of these incredible threads together across centuries of history, multiple continents, and competing sociological theories, Wilson's 1966 thesis holds up with remarkable, almost frightening accuracy.
Modernization, the fragmentation of social diversity, and the undeniable rise of a pragmatic, scientific worldview have inevitably, systematically eroded the social power of religious institutions.
The evidence, when viewed cumulatively, is overwhelming. Whether you are looking at the empty pews and the state's usurpation of welfare functions in England, the dilution of doctrine and the hollowing out of theology in America, the bureaucratic panic that drove ecumenical corporate mergers, or the persistence of highly isolated sects fighting a rearguard action against modernity, the macro trajectory is clear.
Religion has shifted from being the central, unquestioned organizing principle of human society to being a private, epiphenomenal individual lifestyle choice.
Which brings us back to the architect himself, Brian R. Wilson. Because as we noted at the very beginning, he wasn't celebrating this conclusion. He was a conservative functionalist who was deeply worried about the foundation of the societal building.
He was. And the profound question he leaves us with, a question drawn directly from his functionalist anxieties about how a society survives, is this. Throughout recorded history, shared religion provided the moral glue, the common narrative, and the baseline trust required for a large group of humans to function together.
It provided the ultimate transcendent justification for why we should be good to one another, even when it isn't economically beneficial.
If religion is completely relegated to the private sphere, if it is just a personal hobby you do on Sundays rather than a societal framework, what is going to provide the shared moral consensus to hold hyper-individualistic modern societies together in the future?
Exactly. Can a society survive indefinitely purely on a pragmatic Weltanschauung? Is a purely economic and legal framework, just cause and effect, market forces, and bureaucratic rules, enough to sustain a true community when faced with an existential crisis that requires shared sacrifice? Or will the cracks in the foundation eventually compromise the entire structure?
It fundamentally changes how you view the landscape around you. It makes you look at those empty, echoing cathedrals in Europe and those increasingly hollow, gentrified megachurches in America, not just as architectural anomalies, but as warning signs. Are they just empty buildings, or are they monuments to a moral cohesion we haven't figured out how to replace yet? Something for you to mull over the next time you walk past one of those grand old structures, or the next time you hear a debate about where our values come from. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the structures of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.